What are the queries responsible for? This is the question actually we had at the beginning. What are the queries, respective queries responsible for helping developers change the characteristics of a DB object, DB group of objects? So the characteristics are the main intention here to be altered, to be modified. Characteristics of what? The objects. What are the objects? The entities, the stored procedures, the views, all the objects we have inside the database. They are question of having properties and characteristics. We are not talking about changing the values, the data. No, the objects. The student name is Ali. We are going to change it to Ali 2020. No, it's not this. We are not talking about the data, the value. We are talking about the objects. It means the table itself, the stored procedure itself, the architecture of an object itself, the schema, and so on. So they are the DDL related queries. They are the DDL related queries. DDL, data definition related queries. So they are the alter, create maybe, truncate, drop maybe, and so on. So they queries, the queries that they create or modify the objects. The update, no. The update, no. Why? Because the update, it is to change the values, the data inside the object, not the object, which is not the concern of this question here. So simply, the answer is alter, data, truncate, drop, something like that. Even the create, and so on. Let's come back to our context. We were able to define the themes very clearly, and we stressed on that, and still we stress on that. The security actually of the SQL Server starts by the themes that we can see across the life cycle of the SQL Server based database-based projects, SQL Server databases-based projects. And those themes, they are actually mainly they are classified into 4 groups. Those groups, they are the ones responsible for giving different views throughout the work with the database. Means which one to choose. Are we going to implement the 4? This is the first time we meet such a scenario. No, we are going to start, for example, create a project, a function to ameliorate from whether the eddy wave. We have the eddy wave, our ERP system here, our educational portal. And we are awarded a task to ameliorate the functionality of something. We are going to build a new function inside the eddy wave. Okay. Which security we are going the functions in eddy wave? So we are going to use the Microsoft products, and the database for sure it is the SQL Server. This is our platform. No, we know that. So we are going to enhance the security from the beginning. We are going to use the TSQL for all the transactions. TSQL for all the transactions. And while implementing, while developing, while creating, we have to go beyond the secure view of all the transactions. For example, we implement the property, the asset, the isolation level, the transaction mode. Yes. And also, we have to talk about the theme, the security theme we are going to implement from the beginning. In order, from the beginning means from when we start the creation of the project or the task. So we have to settle the security theme. This means that we have to have a decision which theme to choose. Are we going to use the 4 of those themes to build the project? For example, the chat box. We're going to build a chat box in between the advisor and the student. This chat box, it needs to save the messages sent from the advisor and from the student and so on, and keeps the track and the history of all the communications. So the history and the messages, they are going to be stored in an SQL Server table or group of tables. What is the security theme to choose? Which one? Actually, here we can go beyond more than one theme to choose, but you have to recognize that we are not having to have them the full to say that yes, we are obeying to the standardized theme view or theme scenario, theme security. No. Why? Because we are not going to install the SQL Server from new. We are going to use the available SQL Server framework. So the secure by default, we are not going to customize here. We are not going to do anything. The SQL Server is already installed. So the secure by default, it's not the theme you're going to check or to set. Never. Why? Because already the SQL Server is installed. So by default here, it is one level that you will find it ready already and just will obey. Secure by design. Design of what? Design of the objects. Yes, but here the secure by design here is not the concern of design in the objects. The object's architecture does not influence the security. Why? Because the architecture needs to fit the data, the value to acquire. That's it. Referential integrity and references and relationships. Yes, this is another view. This is another scenario. We have to design the architecture of the relationships in between the entities. Yes, absolutely, it can be. So here, secure by design is one of the themes that we are going to implement. Secure by deployment. What does it mean? Whenever we are going to pass to the production scenario, production level, production view, we will talk about the security. Absolutely, because we're going to implement, and then after we're going to produce. We will see the project in question running. So once it is running, we have to be preventive, and we will have to take the precaution to make it secure more and more. So now this is the second theme that might be installed, might be set for the case we are discussing. Secure communications. Are we going to make communications inside the system in order to talk about the secure communication? Absolutely, yes. I given you the example of the chat engine in between the advisor and the student. So this is a 100% communication scenario. And communication is not because it's chat, no, but because messages or data to be sent from the advisor and also messages to be sent from the student and retrieved by the advisor and the vice versa, retrieved by the students. So there is a communicated media. So when we make these communications processes, we have to set the security also. Thus, now for the example we took, which is the EduWave enhancement, or let's say the chat engine inside the EduWave, for this example, we are in phase of implementing the three themes here: secure by design, secured by deployment, and secure the communications, based on the need of the project. The decision here is not because I said or you said. It is based on the need of the project. The project requires those themes to be seen, those security paradigms to be seen. The by default, no. Why? Because this secure by default is a scenario via which we deploy prevention or preventive measurements or security measurements, but while installing the tool, which is the SQL Server, while installing the framework, which is the SQL Server, at the time that the SQL Server is already installed, we are not going to reinstall. No, we are going to use it. It's ready already. So we will not talk about, we will not tackle this theme. Okay, since you have no questions, actually, we continue. The themes, actually, they are one of the concerns that we have actually to consider usually, because it's one of the measurements that really they enhance the security. Remember only that the secure, let's say, the security that has to be imposed on all the communication, because actually dealing with the database means that will be a remote access. We saw that everything has to be set as, we said that it is by obligation, it has to be remote. We do not have to allow, as developers, we do not, say, our database security specialists, we do not have to allow the work on the database directly. There have to be actually an interface to use to connect remotely to the database management system and to use the data and to connect to the concerned objects, databases and objects remotely. Using the APIs, we define 3 APIs in this course, which are the SSMS, SSDT, and the Visual Studio. So the main concern here behind the communications, the main scenario behind of the use of the database is to make communications, and those communications, they have to be secure enough. The secure communication process or theme or paradigm is seen when we talk about that we have to include the authentication and the authorization process. Who is going to be authenticated, who is going to be authorized. Authenticated, for example, to access, authorized to see an object or to visualize a value. This is a concern of security, secure communication. Also, for the secure communications process or paradigm, the use of the schemas. The use of the schemas is one of the very famous and, let's say, required process. Secure communications, we mean. We are tackling mainly. The core SQL Server development okay, authentication, authorization, use a schema that we have actually. The developers or the implementer, the developer has to consider, means every group of entities or objects has to be belonging to a dedicated schema to clarify and to secure groups. Also, there have to be actually a scenario of encryption and cryptography to be set whenever we pass data. Whenever we make a transaction, there have to be actually a cryptography scenario and encryption of data within the database and while in transit. Means whenever we talk about submitting transaction, a TSQL transaction, there have to be an encryption. Whenever you talk about updating data from within the database itself, we have to make actually encryption whenever needed. Also, for the security of the communicated medias or data inside the database or from the database, there has to be an audit to monitor the events and the activities inside the database or based on the use of the database. Auditing and monitored, let's say, activities. or events from within the database itself. The origin, remember the word origin. And moreover than that, the SQL Server itself, the database itself, it has to be put into a secure environment, which is here the serves that the attackers use. The environment where the SQL Server is, it is the full serves that the attackers use to attack. Here we talk about the serves that the attackers use to attack a database object. What it concerns actually the attack serves, by default, the non-needed features, they are actually to be turned off by the SQL Server. So here we talk about the secure by default. By default, if something is not required by the database management system, it is turned as a service or a functionality. It is going to be turned off. By whom? By the SQL Server itself, by the database management system itself. Or manually by the developer who is going to install the environment, the framework. Because whatever we turn off, later on we may turn on for a need or another, for any reason. Automatically, by default, features which are not required, they are going to be turned off. I'll give an example actually. To use the SQL Server upon a browser, no, it's not required by default. The SQL Server is going to be used through an API. Also, to use the command line interface to pass commands to the SQL Server, it has to be by default turned off unless we need it or the developer needs it. So it is going to be turned on. But by default, it is turned off. The command line interface, the XP CMD shell command. There are by default actually surface area, SQL Server surface area configuration tool dedicated to configuring the entry points of the SQL Server, and this is actually to facilitate the work of administration. Means the attack surface here is the surface where the SQL Server runs in or used to send in and out data, to pass in and out data. So that for the interface that the SQL Server is using for in and out values, there is actually a SQL Server area configuration tool that can be utilized to help the administrators to turn in or off any feature required. Any feature required. So the CMD shell, the command shell, it's a command for passing commands to help in opening the interface to pass commands to the SQL Server. And the configure, it's another query that can be utilized to, to configure the SQL Server surface area in the sense of from where to use the SQL Server, there will be actually an interface. So the interface is having a tool, and there is a tool to configure it. Because of from the very famous configurations to configure the SQL Server surface area is the policies set by the organization in question. Policies management. There is actually a utility that actually we can see it nowadays within the recent SQL Server. Actually, the new SQL Server 2012 and up, it is using the policy-based management framework (PBM) to pass to configure the interface, the SQL Server interface, the surface area. policy-based management, PBM, policy-based management. Yes, and from the adoption of the security themes, actually, we will be able to configure the access control and the generation of the access control list to allow the use of the data inside the database based on the pattern of the architecture, the physical architecture. But who is allowed based on the session, there will be an access control list to control all the priors to access. Any questions here, please? Any questions here at this level?
No, mister.
Okay, this is great. This is great. Just one step further. I got it stuck. He's not moving. So what it concerns actually the contained databases, actually, we have to recognize that this is a new feature from the SQL Server 2012, but regardless it's new or old, what is it? It is actually a mechanism that helps to authenticate a session, to authenticate a user, a login directly against a specific database without using a server login. What does it mean? Means without using the server login, we know the SQL Server and the SSMS interface or the Visual Studio username and password interface. There will be a chance to use the database without being authenticated using the authentication mechanism from the SQL Server. This is due to the defined contained database. Let's just terminate this context of the contained database, and then after we continue to the other. Okay, regardless, just one of the very famous actually concerns that we have to recognize whenever we talk about the SQL Server security, which is we are talking about security. Why? For what? Actually, to avoid any issues, any circumstances that can be done later on due to any non-ethical or non-legitimate use of the database. If the database is available and open and everybody can use, so from these, anybody that can use, there might be somebody non-technical can delete or can edit or can alter or can hide or can change any object inside the database. The table, the views, a procedure, whatever he has, or the database has, an unskilled party can damage the content. So that's it's trivial that it has to be covered, it has to be secured. So how the intentionally doing bad actions on database, which are here the hackers, do attack SQL Server? There are scenarios via which We may talk about the, let's attack SQL Server. Okay, if I ask you now, let's check the security level of the EduWave, and let's attack the EduWave, since the EduWave is using the SQL Server as a database. What we should do? Is there a list of buttons to click? No, we have to build our tactic to attack the SQL Server database in the EduWave. Okay, the tactics, they are actually built on a group of considerations. Is the EduWave using the database to access the database objects? Not administrated, and it is very weak, that we can actually explore and exploit and open background resources. Means, can we open directly the database used by the EduWave? This is a consideration that we have to look at, which is covered by the administrators in question, the EduWave administrators. The EduWave is an example only. If yes, so we can explore this weakness and we try to hack. There is no order here. It's a matter of count only. It means those ways how attackers hack, there is no first, second, third. No. It's only a list of activities that hackers can do. They might do one or two or three or all. It depends on the level of success. If they succeeded in one, that's it. I go to the last one, for example, intelligent observation. This is a way that hackers use to attack SQL Server. It is not the second or the last. It's just one way, one of the ways that the attackers or hackers do follow to attack a SQL Server. What is the intelligent observation? It's a concern of visualizing what is happening and how to use the database or the project in question. Given an eye or keeping an eye on the use of the system until everything is clear. And here it's not only to observe, to see, to watch, but to observe, to watch smartly, with smartness, to be very smart, clever. So intelligent observation. What does mean smart observation? It means we have the observer who is observing the database usage has to be very intelligent to succeed in capturing the weaknesses and exploiting the weaknesses and use them later. If there is any combinations of usage of objects, or if any misfunction in functionality or something like that, so intelligently hackers have to watch the use of the database, and based on the consequences and conclusions, they would attack the SQL Server. With the very famous SQL injection, it's one of the very famous database attack techniques that can be utilized not only by upon SQL Server, but all the database management systems. They are facing the SQL injection attacks usually. Attackers try to use falsified SQL queries to attack the databases. Using databases over browser. This is not the feature that has to actually over the SQL Server. It is by default off unless activated. So if it is activated, there are chances to open the objects without any authentication and without any consent or authorization. Also, if the database management system is using a weak password or no password even. So from here also they can attack. Any questions, please? Are you with me? If you hear your name, please just say yes. Okay.
Yes, Mr. With you.
Okay.